Hello there, Epidemics. Hope everybody's doing well this week. We're getting awfully close to the end of the semester. So, if you have assignments that you have not completed yet, be aware that we are coming up against a relatively hard deadline. So if you've got things that are late, go ahead and submit them. Depending on how late they are, you will get either partial credit or full credit. But getting them in is more important than, not getting them in. Partial credit's a lot better than a 0 for your grade. So the assignments that were posted, I think it was Saturday rather than Friday. I should quit saying I'm going to post them on Fridays. I usually get them in on Saturdays, but that's due this coming weekend. The project is coming up. So it is due on Sunday, April 30th. If you are going to be doing a presentation, that will be done on, May 2nd, which is our last lecture. So I'm going to, our last lecture is May 2nd, and the last set of assignments and all late things will be due on Sunday, May 7th. Okay, so we've been talking about malaria, and I was asked last time, we went through this bizarre, complicated life cycle of malaria, the parasite, and it was asked, what exactly do we need to know? So here is what you need to know about the malaria life cycle. You guys are not going to be parasitologists unless you change careers. You are going to go off. This is a non-majors course. You probably aren't going to go into science. You're welcome to change your mind, but you don't have to. This is designed for non-scientists. So here's what I want you to remember. Not the actual names of the steps, not very much in the way of details. I want you to know malaria is a parasite, so it is not a bacteria, it is not a virus, it's not an animal either. It's in a totally different category of organisms. It infects two different types of organisms, a mosquito, which is an insect, and humans, and we're mammals. We're very, very different organisms with different immune systems, different cell types. In the mosquito, malaria can infect both the digestive tract and the salivary gland, two different kinds of tissues, very, very different types of cells. In humans, malaria infects the liver and the red blood cells. Again, very, very different kinds of cells. Each phase of malaria, so the merozoite phase, the gametocyte phase, the sporozoite phase, and all the others, they can produce offspring that are different than the adults. So the offspring look different and they behave differently than the parent phase, and they're able to infect different tissues or even different organisms than the parents. So this complicated life cycle is because the parasite has to be able to infect the different organisms and the different tissue types within those organisms. So it's a very, very, very complicated life cycle. this is pretty much what I really want you to take from this material, is how complicated biology is, especially compared to what you may think you know about biology. It's way more complicated than that. And I hope that you kind of get this feeling of amazement about how these organisms are able to make their living and survive in such a complicated way. I mean, I'm just awestruck whenever I talk about malaria, because it just does something that if we were to sit down and try and design something that did this, yeah, we can't do that. It's way too complicated. Eric, go ahead.
So does it only infect humans and mosquitoes? Like, does it infect other animals as well that are mammals?
Okay, good question. Malaria, the ones that we are talking about, we're talking about the human infected malarias. The ones that infect humans cannot infect other mammals, but there are other species of malaria that can infect not only mammals, different mammal species, but also birds and reptiles.
That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to move on from their life cycle, and we're going to talk about what happens to a person who is infected. Generally speaking, when we talk about the symptoms come every 2 to 3 days. So there will be an increase in symptoms or an attack of the disease. Each wave or attack lasts between 6 and 10 hours, so not very long. This goes right along with the reproduction rate of the malaria that infects red blood cells, that specific stage of the life cycle. Because if I go back to the previous slide, this phase that infects red blood cells can produce more of their own phase. Okay, I've got to step back a little bit. In the liver, the phase that is released from liver cells that can infect red blood cells, those get released in batches. So a cell literally fills up with parasites and explodes. And those parasites go out, and within a relatively short time period, they infect red blood cells. The reproductive cycle in the red blood cells does a similar thing. They fill up the red blood cells with parasites until the red blood cell explodes. Because a large number, thousands or tens of thousands of red blood cells are infected at once, they're on the same time period for reproduction. So a whole bunch of them will release their parasites, they'll explode at the same time, putting more parasites out. Those parasites then infect the next group of red blood cells. They're on the same life cycle, so they'll release their parasites, basically within a very short time period. So the kinds of symptoms people get, a lot of these are things that we call flu-like symptoms. They're kind of general: fatigue, fever, chills, nausea. You can have vomiting, muscle aches, headaches. When a person is in the middle of a malaria attack, they are most infectious. And infected humans who are in the middle of an attack release some odor we're not quite sure exactly what is being released, but they release some odor that is extra attractive to mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are more likely to bite people who are in the middle of a malaria attack than other people. Talk about, you want to say it's clever of the parasite, but it's a single cell. It doesn't have a brain. It doesn't think about things, but really, really interesting.
It
So
almost sounds like it adapted to increase its own infectivity.
it did, exactly. It adapted to increase its own infectivity. Good point. So people who go through these rounds of infection, your immune system starts to wear out. You start to not recover as much in between these attacks. And if you can't fight off these attacks, eventually you're going to have problems like kidney failure, seizures, mental confusion, and coma. And yes, lots and lots of people die every year from malaria, even today. So one of the big problems, one of the reasons for these later symptoms, the more severe symptoms, the seizures, the mental confusion, the coma, and the death, is because the parasites consume hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the molecule in red blood cells that actually attaches to oxygen and carries oxygen. But the parasite's destroying that. It's eating the hemoglobin, it's destroying red blood cells. So people end up with anemia. And that is when we start to have these more severe problems. These short-term flu-like symptoms, a lot of that is your immune system trying to fight off the parasite, trying to do something about this parasite. These are side effects of your immune system or actually direct effects of your immune system. So, for example, fever is something your immune system triggers to help the immune system and to help fight off the disease. We can also see jaundice as a result of destruction of the red blood cells, or RBCs. Jaundice is a yellowish color to the skin and eyes. We tend to think of it as a sign of liver disease, but it can also be a sign of too many red blood cells being destroyed. And of course, there's even more than that. When red blood cells are infected by malaria, they have a change to the surface of the cell. So this is a uninfected red blood cell. The surface of it, this is an electron micrograph, false color. The surface of this is relatively smooth. You see a little bit of texture here, but not much. This is important because your capillaries, the small blood vessels, are, the smallest ones are basically just the right size for a single red blood cell to squeeze through. And we need them to be smooth on the surface and somewhat flexible so that they can move smoothly through our blood vessels. But these infected cells have these bumps on the surface that make those red blood cells kind of sticky. So they can stick to each other. They can stick to the walls of blood vessels. And this is important because by sticking to the walls of blood vessels or clogging blood vessels by sticking to other red blood cells, this prevents the parasite from reaching the spleen, or I should say the infected cells. The spleen is one of the organs that's involved in filtering your blood. And the spleen can kill the parasite in the red blood cells. So it is part of your immune response in this instance. It helps to kill off these infected cells or kill off the parasite within the infected cells. The stickiness and clogs can cause a lot of damage to different parts of the body, depending on where the blood vessels are that they block up. So if there's damage to the blood vessels in the brain, and there are clots or clogs, or there's a lot of red blood cells sticking to the walls, this is similar to a small stroke. So a stroke is when, okay, there are a couple of different kinds of stroke, but one of the major ones happens when a blood vessel gets clogged, and then you don't get blood supply and oxygen to part of the brain. You can get the same effect from infected red blood cells, usually in the smaller blood vessels. So you get some effects, but usually they're not massive like you can get with a big stroke. But this causes, lack of oxygen to the brain, mental confusion and seizures. It can cause swelling of the brain. Swelling of the brain is really dangerous. It can cause very serious, even permanent damage. And depending on what was damaged and how bad the damage was, this damage can persist after the infection and become permanent. We see a similar thing in the kidneys. The kidneys are important for removing waste products from the bloodstream. And they have a lot of small blood vessels because they have to get a lot of stuff out of the bloodstream. So again, clogs and clots can cause damage to the kidneys. If you get kidney failure, that is a very serious condition. You have to be treated with dialysis, which is something that takes hours to do and has to be done every few days, so multiple times a week, depending on how bad your kidneys are, or eventually a kidney transplant. Severe malaria can also cause what's called hypoglycemia. Hypo always means low or less than. Glycemia refers to sugar. You may have heard of the glycemic index. They talk about that with diabetes a lot. Comes from the same root. So this is low blood sugar. Your brain needs sugar. If you don't have enough sugar in the blood, it causes damage to the brain. Coma and death. Again, more brain damage. Other parts of the body can get energy from other sources, but the brain is really limited to what energy sources it can use. Malaria can also cause what's called pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs. You're not breathing very well. You're not getting a lot of oxygen in your blood supply. You are also at high risk of a bacterial infection that can cause pneumonia. Again, we're seeing all of these different ways that it's cutting down on the human's oxygen supply, the human's energy supply for the brain. And if that wasn't enough, it also produces toxins. So this thing is really, really nasty. We know that it also makes mosquitoes sick. We don't have as much detail on what it does to mosquitoes, but we know that infected mosquitoes don't tend to live as long as healthy mosquitoes. So when we look at these parasites, they are very good at evading the immune system. You got different forms. Some forms infect the liver, some infect red blood cells. Some are specifically designed to be taken up by mosquitoes for sexual reproduction. By both hiding in cells and having different forms, this makes it harder for your immune system to recognize it. Now, remember those sticky spikes sticking out of the red blood cells? That is a parasite-produced protein. And the immune system can't recognize that. But if you thought things were complicated, yeah. The parasite has the ability to change the shape of that surface protein. And when you change the shape of that surface protein, the immune system cannot recognize it anymore. It looks completely different to the immune system. So the immune system has to start over again. You can't build up that adaptive immune system to go after the infected red blood cells, because by the time you get the adaptive immune system up and running, you've got a different target. And you got to go back to that initial immune response, which is fast but relatively weak. And I just kind of threw this image in here to kind of emphasize all of the different ways that the malaria parasite can manifest. So these are the 4 different human infecting Plasmodium or malaria parasites. And these are 4 different phases of the life cycle. So these are stained microscope images. And you can see this phase has a distinct look infecting red blood cells. This phase looks a little different. This phase looks very different. And this phase looks even more different. So we can see that there's just a lot of different visual appearances. We also have, differences about what's on the surface of the infected cells or on the gametocyte itself. So your immune system just really has a hard job to figure out what's going on and attack it. Diagnosis is difficult. We don't have a simple test. The way that we diagnose malaria is looking at red blood cells under the microscope. So I've got 2 images over here. This one at the top has several infected cells. They're pretty obvious. You can see these dark staining areas within the cells. This is a normal red blood cell, none of that purple or darker stain. But when we look at this image, these are white blood cells here. They take up a lot of that purple stain. These are infected cells. You can see the parasite, but you can imagine if it was early in the infection, if for whatever reason the staining didn't work right, it could be very easy to not be able to see these, not find them on the slide. They might not even be on the slide. This is a heavy infection right here. Both of these have a lot of parasite. These people are very, very, or were very, very sick when their blood was taken. So it depends on the skill and the patience of the person looking at the slide. It's relatively cheap, which is good because most places where malaria is prevalent are not as wealthy. There are other types of tests, but they're not great and they're much more expensive. So the treatment, how we're going to treat this disease, depends on a couple of different factors. Which species of malaria? So remember, we talked about how there are at least 4 different species that infect humans, and the different ones need to be treated differently. The ones that can hide out in the liver for years and years, you got to get medication into that liver, which is a hard thing to do. Treating liver infections is really challenging because one of the jobs of the liver is to take drugs, which our body treats as poisons or toxins. It doesn't recognize them, and it breaks them down. How do we figure out the species? Where was the person infected? I don't mean where on the body, I mean what part of the world. There is some overlap. There are some places where there are multiple species of parasite, and there are some places where there's only one species. So that can help, or at least help narrow down the species. Knowing where the person was infected is also important because just like bacteria, there is drug resistance. And the drug resistance tends to be found in specific areas. So if you got infected in, we'll say Tanzania in Africa, the parasite that's there may be resistant to, we're going to call it drug A, whereas if you got infected in Brazil, in South America, it may be susceptible to drug A. So that can help figure that out. If it's Plasmodium falciparum, which is the most commonly in Africa, that one is the nasty one. They're all nasty. This one is the most dangerous. And people often need hospitalization. Treatment is also going to depend on the clinical status of the patient. How severe are the symptoms? How healthy is the patient? Has the patient taken antimalarials, especially if they took them prophylactically or as a preventative measure? If they got malaria after taking a prophylactic or preventative medicine, the parasite's going to likely be resistant to the drug. This is a problem because most malaria prophylaxis these drugs that help prevent malaria that people take while they're tourists, they have side effects. Some people tolerate them very, very well and never have side effects. But when I went to Tanzania, I went on a group tour. There were about 12 of us. We all started out taking an anti-malarial prophylaxis. I think only 2 people managed to stay on it for the entire course of the trip. This tells you that a lot of people have low doses of this medication in their bloodstream. Lots of people quit taking it, which is a good way to get prevented or resistance to that drug. Personally, I was allergic to it. I had to stop. There was no question about it. But other people had problems with severe insomnia, nightmares, muscle cramps. What else was there? There were some other ones. It's been a while, but you get the idea. The side effects were too severe for most of our group to persist. If you're feeling awful, you're not enjoying your trip. And let's be honest, for most people, if you get to go to someplace like Africa, it's often a once in a lifetime opportunity. So one of the things we can do when you've got someone infected is treat them with multiple medications. We talked about this with antibiotic resistance. If you've got someone who's very severely infected, you can give them multiple antibiotics to help reduce the likelihood that the bacteria will become resistant. Same thing with malaria parasites. Multiple medications can reduce resistance. Oh, and here in my notes, other people in our group, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Yeah, you don't want to be taking a medication that makes you have vomiting when you're on vacation. So if you have the opportunity to go someplace where there is malaria, what can you do? You taking the drug, it's kind of risky. You may be fine, you may not. You want to look up the risk for where you're going, not only the country, but the region, because that makes a difference. This can be hard to find. So when you go and you're looking up, do I need to worry about malaria? I'm going to Tanzania. Well, it turns out that our group was going to look at animals. We were on safari. So we were mostly staying in tourist resorts and camping. And we weren't in local communities. We weren't in cities very much. So our risk was significantly lower. If we'd been visiting communities, especially more rural communities, the risk would have been higher. So you can take that kind of idea and try and use that to make a decision. What I love are mosquito bed nets. You can buy a mosquito bed net that is infused with pesticide. So if a malaria parasite, or I'm sorry, if a mosquito lands on it, they die. They can't get through the bed nets. you want to take your own. They're not very expensive. Last time I bought one, it was like $25. Don't assume that one will be available when you get there. And even if someone says, we have them available, don't assume that they're not going to have holes in them or that they're going to be impregnated with pesticides. I do travel a lot to places where malaria is common. If I haven't gone recently, and when I say a lot, you know, every 4 or 5 years, I always get a new bed net. I always get a new mosquito net before I go. And I tend to leave it when I come back. So the last place I stay, especially if I'm in a rural area, they're going to get to keep that mosquito net. So mosquito nets work very, very well for preventing malaria exposure. Now, malaria is worse in children than adults. Adults in areas where malaria is common and develop immunity. But immunity requires multiple rounds of infection. And the immunity wanes or decreases with time. So if you're not being re-exposed regularly, you're going to lose that immunity. But the fact that you can develop an immunity if you're exposed repeatedly is why it's not as deadly in adults. Adults have already survived multiple rounds of malaria infection. And we're going to talk about, there are some genes that some people have that make them resistant to malaria. But we're going to get to that a little bit later. We've been talking a lot about the science. So we're going to take a step to talk a little bit about the history of malaria. So malaria is an ancient disease. I told you already, we have evidence that dinosaurs were infected with malaria. So malaria has been around and it's been a disease longer than humans have existed. So humans and malaria evolved together, and that started here in Africa, where humans first evolved. Once farming began, we started having larger communities. You guys know what I'm going to be saying here, right? Forming these larger communities favors the spread of a lot of different diseases, including malaria. So larger communities, malaria becomes, you know, more common. It's easier for malaria to find new people to infect. And the earliest strain or the earliest species was Plasmodium vivax. So vivax, there is a genetic mutation. It's called the Duffy antigen. And the Duffy antigen, it's a specific protein on the surface of red blood cells that is required for infection of those red blood cells. If you don't have the Duffy antigen on your red blood cells, Plasmodium vivax cannot infect you. By 5,000 years ago, pretty much almost everyone born on the continent of Africa was missing the Duffy antigen. Even with all of the migration that has happened in the past 5,000 years, over 90% of Africans are lacking the Duffy antigen. And a very high percent of people with African ancestry who have left the continent of Africa have this antigen. So Plasmodium vivax was able to migrate out of Africa and became established in Europe and in Asia. And eventually it made it over to what we call the New World, the Americas. And vivax is not very common in Africa. Unfortunately, a new parasite evolved, Plasmodium falciparum. This is the really nasty one. Plasmodium falciparum requires a relatively high population in order to persist. Vivax has that dormant state. That's the one that can be dormant in the liver. This means that somebody can be infected and survive longer time periods while infected. And then when they start having symptoms, they may be in a new population, or the population where they live may have lost their immunity, but it allows it to persist at a lower population density. Falciparum cannot do that. Falciparum, has a higher case fatality rate, and it is able, remember I mentioned the ability to change the red blood cell surface proteins? We call that changing antigens. An antigen is a protein that will trigger an immune response, basically. So falciparum is the one that can change antigens.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned that this destroys the hemoglobin in blood.
Yes.
And isn't it the iron in hemoglobin that gives blood its red color?
Yes.
So wouldn't infected blood eventually, say you took like a test tube, something like that, and infected it with malaria, would it eventually change color as the hemoglobin's destroyed?
Excellent question. The answer is actually no. The red color is specifically the iron molecule. And because iron is an atom, that cannot be destroyed. So even if the hemoglobin, which is proteins, the proteins are destroyed, the iron is still in the red blood cells.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good question. Okay. Generally speaking, what goes on in falciparum infections is that the phase of the parasite that infects a red blood cell, when they produce a new generation of parasites, the new generation is going to have a different antigen than the parent. So this is what's bypassing that adaptive immune response that I mentioned earlier. there are a limited number of available antigens for the parasite. So the more exposures you have, the more likely you're going to have immune memory for the different antigens, and the more likely you're going to be able to fight off the parasite. Because this falciparum, the new parasite, was so severe, we started seeing more genetic mutations showing up. The loss of the Duffy antigen, as far as I know, doesn't really seem to cause a lot of problems for people, but these mutations tend to do that. So thalassemia, G6PD, and sickle cell anemia are the three diseases we're going to talk about. The three genetic mutations that we're going to talk about that cause resistance to malaria, but also cause disease. And of course, we'll focus on sickle cell anemia because that is the most common one. Even though these diseases cause health problems, malaria is so nasty that 1 out of every 14 people worldwide has at least one allele for one of these conditions. So what is an allele? It is a version of a gene. In our cells, we have 2 copies of each gene, but they can be different versions. And so the allele is just the scientific name for the different versions of it. We're going to talk first about sickle cell anemia, which is the most common allele that provides resistance for malaria. So in sickle cell, the allele results in a change in shape of the red blood cells. So if we look at the image on the left, again, this is an image through a microscope, and we see these round red blood cells. But then we also see these other blood cells that are curved. So they've got this funny shape. This is kind of what we tend to think of, but we also see, you know, this one looks kind of like a football. This one's elongated and weird looking. Lots of elongated, weird looking, some curved. You know, these are those, what we call sickle cell red blood cells. When we talk about this gene, one allele confers resistance and generally few, if any, symptoms. 2 copies of that allele causes a disease called sickle cell anemia, which can be fatal without modern medical treatments. Oops. So let's get into this a little bit more detail. So again, 1 copy of the sickle cell allele gives you resistance. 2 copies can be fatal. Not immediately, not but later on in life, usually by the teens or in the teens, teen years. So if you've got two parents who are both carriers, they have one copy of the sickle cell allele, they will give one allele to each child. So if we say the black color indicates the non-sickle cell allele, and the red color indicates the sickle cell allele, this is the odds or the percentage of their offspring that are likely to have each of these conditions. So there's a 50-50 chance that the father will give a copy of the sickle cell allele to any offspring that is produced. There's a 50-50 chance that the mother will provide the sickle cell allele for any child that is produced. So this ends up with a 25% chance that the kid will not have a copy of the sickle cell gene. If you've done did Punnett squares ever in school, that's basically what we're doing here. There is a 25% chance the kid got the sickle cell allele from their father, and a 25% chance that a child will get the sickle cell allele from the mother. So that's a 50% chance they will have one copy of sickle cell allele. And there's a 25% chance they will have two copies of the sickle cell allele. Now, this means that two parents who are carriers could lose 25% of their offspring to sickle cell anemia before those kids have a chance to reproduce. But they have a 50% chance that their offspring, in each individual offspring, will be a carrier. Carrier is the best condition for someone in an area where Plasmodium falciparum is common. So these kids are most likely to survive malaria infections. This kid is most vulnerable to malaria infections. This kid is most vulnerable to sickle cell anemia, or the disease state. Whew, this is complicated. The mortality rate for malaria is so high that in areas with Plasmodium falciparum, up to 40% of the population have at least one copy of the sickle cell allele. Because the likelihood of children dying from malaria is so high that on a population level, losing 25% of the population of the children born still provides enough of an advantage because half of the children born are protected. So at the population level, losing 25% of children is worth the price to save 50% of the children from malaria. Obviously, that's not the case on an individual level, but at the population level, it is. A couple will lose fewer children to sickle cell anemia than they would lose to malaria if none of their kids had sickle cell alleles. Okay, so whew. How does sickle cell anemia or sickle cell allele result in resistance to malaria? So the sickle shape tends to result from any kind of harm to red blood cells. So what do I mean by this? This can be an infection. That's the most likely thing to trigger it, but also low blood oxygen, low blood sugar. These kinds of things can often trigger that shape change. So it's not that somebody with sickle cell anemia or sickle cell carrier always has the sickle-shaped red blood cells. They will have them sometimes, and not all of their red blood cells will have this sickle shape. But once it forms that sickle shape, so it'll form that sickle shape in response to being infected by malaria. So once infected, get that shape change. And now these abnormal red blood cells have a shorter lifespan than healthy round red blood cells. And the shorter lifespan means that the red blood cell will die too soon for that large number of offspring, that reproduction of offspring from the parasite that originally infected the red blood cell. So what you're doing by killing off these red blood cells, or by these red blood cells dying too soon, you're not providing enough time for the parasite to reproduce. If you have one copy of the sickle cell allele, you will have a small percentage of abnormal red blood cells. This results in a lower total parasite load. So the parasite might infect a cell that will not go through this shape change, but this does mean that some of the parasites, enough of the parasites will infect red blood cells that will do this shape change that you have fewer total parasites, which means that you're less sick, and therefore it's easier, and the lower parasite load makes it easier for immediate, that short-term immune response to get rid of the parasites. All right, so that is basically sickle cell anemia slash malaria resistance. You guys have questions on that? Do you need me to go back and explain any of it again?
I actually have one question. What is the health side effects of sickle cell?
Hmm.
Because I know that it's pretty common in the US as well, and I'm wondering like what are the side effects of it?
Okay, sickle cell anemia is the condition with 2 copies of that allele. So what's going on in sickle cell anemia? Whenever there's a trauma, like I said, infections, low blood sugars, low oxygen levels, any of these things can trigger an outbreak or an episode where a lot of the red blood cells form that abnormal shape. Those red blood cells don't live as long, so we end up with anemia. In this case, not enough healthy red blood cells. And that means you're going to have less oxygen to tissues. The other thing that happens is those sickle-shaped red blood cells will clog up small blood vessels. So you can have an incredible range of symptoms depending on where those clogs happen. So you can have problems with damage to kidneys. You can have, a lot of people have severe muscle cramps or pain in the joints. Brain fog. Again, the brain's not getting enough oxygen, so that can, cause problems with memory, concentration, lots of fatigue. So a lot of the symptoms that you get with malaria, except without the fever and the vomiting, aches, pains, loopy head, or brain fog kind of symptoms. And without treatment, you can end up with these clogs in places that cause damage to, say, your heart. So their heart gets its oxygen and nutrition not from the blood that's inside the heart, but from blood vessels outside the heart. And if those get clogged, you can have damage to the heart muscle. If blood vessels in the lungs get clogged, you can have patches of cell death in the lungs, which means that your lungs are not able to process oxygen and get it into your blood supply as well. You can have clogs in the brain, which can be triggering stroke. So that's kind of what happens with sickle cell anemia. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Medical treatment can help. So there are things that can help if you have modern, wealthy country medicine. So sickle cell is the best known and most widespread of these resistance mutations. Thalassemia is another one. Again, this requires 2 copies of the allele to have symptoms. 1 copy are carriers, no symptoms. And again, this causes an anemia. So it causes low numbers of red blood cells and less total hemoglobin in the red blood cells. Hemoglobin, of course, I've said this, I think, the molecule that carries the oxygen. And people with this fatigue, jaundice, slow growth, and bone deformities. The last one, G6PD, occurs more commonly in males or people with only one X chromosome. People with 2 or more X chromosomes can be carriers, but not symptomatic, because this gene is on the X chromosome. Again, this is going to largely infect people with some African ancestry, just like sickle cell, which I don't know that I mentioned, just like thalassemia. G6PD also shows up in people of Mediterranean and Asian descent, which is different from sickle cell anemia. And again, the red blood cells break down, they don't last as long, especially if you're under stress or taking certain medication. G6PD causes fever, dark urine, pain, and fatigue, and can damage the spleen, liver, and heart. So all of these genetic mutations, these 3 that we talked about, can cause some pretty nasty symptoms in people who have either 2 copies of it, or in the case of G6PD, they only have 1 X chromosome, so they only have 1 copy, or they have 2 copies and they have 2 X chromosomes. All right. Oof. And once again, I talked through the whole class. I didn't give you guys a breakout session. Sorry about that. That's kind of the genetics that's involved in resistance and why we have these genes, because malaria is that freaking deadly. I'm going to talk now in the last few minutes briefly about malaria in ancient Rome. So we think of malaria as happening in tropical areas and largely in what we call the global south, so south of the equator. Malaria has in the past been a lot more widespread than it is now. And so malaria got its name during the time of the Roman Empire. And it got its name because of their theory of miasma. So the Romans believed that diseases were caused by bad smells or bad air. That's what miasma literally, is literally translated as bad air. Mal is bad. Aria is air. So malaria, I think I said that wrong, is literally bad air. I think I said miasma was, but I'm sorry. It's malaria that's literally bad air. Malaria was more common in swampy areas and at times when humidity was high. So this made sense. Humid, swampy air caused malaria. It didn't. It was where you were most likely to find mosquitoes, which carried the parasite. But it made sense during ancient Rome. Weirdly enough, this is also the origin of the word abracadabra. So there weren't a lot of treatments in ancient Rome, and certainly what treatments there were not effective. So one preventative was to wear a piece of papyrus on a necklace with the word abracadabra written on it to protect the wearer from malaria. We do not know what abracadabra meant in the Roman Empire, or where it originated, or why people thought it was a magic word that helped protect them from malaria. There's a lot of ideas out there, but we don't have any evidence to support any of them. But it's just so funny that a word that we use nowadays in magic shows, we go abracadabra, came from the Roman Empire as an attempt to prevent malaria infection.
I've heard that it means I create as I speak or something along those lines.
That's one of the ideas, but we don't really know. Okay, so the next topic's a little bit bigger. So I think we're going to stop here, and then we're going to talk some more about malaria next time. Are there any questions about anything we talked about today? Okay, then, in that case, I will see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you for the rest of the week.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.